We are back with Dr. Steve Graef with Ask Dr. Steve for our Athlete Strong for Mental Health. My name is Dan Mucci, and I'm the Mission Advancement Director here at CNA. Today, we are going to examine the topic of multiple sport athletes. So in recent years, a lot of coaches have discouraged their athletes from playing more than one sport. But some recent studies in the last year or two have shown it might be better for athletes to participate in more than one sport because the wear and tear on their bodies and getting more close competition allows them to feel more comfortable in pressure situations. So we'll look at that with handling some of the stress and anxiety that goes along with playing two sports. And of course, as we move into discussions, Steve, some sports just go together, like cross country and track go together. So it's natural that some of those athletes would play two sports. Sometimes football and wrestling or football and track go together, to name a few. So we'll look at that. And as usual, we'll break it down into a segment on coaches, a segment on athletes, and a segment for the parents. So welcome back, Dr. Steve. Do you have anything you want to say to our viewers out there before we get started?
No, hopefully everybody's out there is happy and healthy and managing things pretty well. So looking forward to another great conversation as well today.
Great. So let's get started. We'll talk about our coaches first. And so, Steve, do you feel that coaches should encourage their athletes to play multiple sports? And as we take a look at that, what would be some of the benefits to a coach of an athlete playing multiple sports? And then what are some of the drawbacks?
I think even the word encourage is kind of an interesting one. I don't know if they necessarily need to encourage it necessarily. I think the problems typically align when they discourage it. And so encourage, they don't need to go out of the way and say, hey, I want you all to be multi-sport athletes. But I think it really brings up an important conversation of how they feel about it, and are they actually discouraging or trying to create obstacles to their athletes being able to participate in multiple sports. From a benefits perspective, when you look at cross training, sports and various individual sports are so unique in the various biomechanics that are associated with being successful in those sports, the skill set that's necessary, both from a mental standpoint, a physical and technical standpoint. So if you think about having an athlete toolbox, if you're involving yourself in these different types of activities, you're putting different skill sets and ways of thinking and perceptual abilities into this toolbox that is ultimately anywhere you go, you're going to have that toolbox with you. So as you're developing these different skills, those skills are going to benefit the other sports that you're participating in. So kind of this high tides raise all ships type of thing. So that's the benefit there. In terms of drawbacks, well, you are opening yourself up to increased risk of burnout, maybe injury, if you're not giving yourself the proper time to recover and have breaks. And unfortunately, there can be some dynamic issues associated with that. If you have to miss some practices for one sport to attend another sport, that could have some impact on how the coach perceives whether you are going to have the amount of playing time that you want. If another kid is not missing practice to go to another sport, maybe they're getting more reps and opportunities. So there are those potential drawbacks and consequences that I think athletes and coaches and parents need to think through before making those decisions.
Yeah, and I can speak from personal experience here. My son was a 3-sport athlete, so that's going to kind of lead into our next question with summer workouts. He really never did take that break because he was either going from football practice to basketball workouts to summer baseball games. So as we kind of talk about summer workouts here, coaches want their athletes and all their workouts and conditioning programs, but should it be the responsibility of the coach to communicate with other coaches, or should an athletic director step in and help facilitate like athletes who want to play multiple sports, or kind of where do you see that coming into play a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. So often we run into issues and conflict because upstream decisions or communication has not been adequately addressed. And so you talk about the athletic director, you talk about the coaches. I think it's really important for the athletic department, coaches included, to have a meeting where they discuss what is our philosophy around multi-sport athletes, who gets the clearance, right, of the runway, as far as who gets priority during which seasons. I think that that's an important conversation to at least be able to have. So then there's a little bit more of a shared agreement amongst coaches, amongst the athletic directors, of how we want to approach this when it comes up. Then somewhere down the line during the end of a season or middle of a season or during summer workouts, when there is a conflict, now it's not on the athlete to necessarily try to figure that out. There's actually a culture around in that athletic department of how we handle those situations.
Yeah, and I think too, it probably goes back to small school versus big school a little bit. Some of your smaller schools don't have the pool to have as many boys or girls, so their athletes are playing more than one sport. Where a larger school, let's say a Jackson or a Glen Oak or a McKinley, just has more student body, so they can pull for more people to play different sports.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know in the last video I kept probably leaning on it depends, and it's going to be individual by individual. And the folks at home may hear that a little bit this time as well, because it is specific. And so that's why, as a department, looking at the school, what can we leverage? What are things that could serve as obstacles, and how do we want to create a culture to help our students be able to navigate multiple sports a little bit more easily?
Yeah, and so I think you kind of just hit on this, like from a two-sport athletes. For instance, if a football player plays basketball, what are some of those rules and conditioning? I know, as I said, my son played multiple sports. It kind of was determined that if you're in football season, you really aren't concerned about basketball. Like you could work out on your own at night, but you can't go to open gym or you can't, go to a basketball workout because you're in football season. Now, in the summer, again, as we talked about, that kind of varied how it goes. So, again, that's probably more of a school rule. And as you were talking about, sort of the athletic department stepping in and kind of being on page one with all coaches.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, kind of who gets the clearance? Is it that first sport of the season that's kind of dragging out a little bit, or are there some other decisions that we're going to determine? I mean, if it's a lot of games in a season and the team isn't doing that well, okay, does the senior now go on to basketball season because, hey, we'll give some sophomores an opportunity to play? Those are some interesting discussions that can happen. But I think that that's based on the culture of the program and the culture of the school.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on this a little bit too, but we'll get into it a little bit more. In terms of like conditioning, fatigue, rest, what should coaches of multiple sport athletes kind of be looking for that's a little bit different than just the kid who plays a singular sport? And so I know probably in Ohio, as you played multiple sports, I think at Lake we've talked about before. Usually the OHSA says between sports, athletes should take a week off without penalty before moving on to the next sport. But again, how do you think that fatigue and rest factor should really play into this?
Well, it's massive. I mean, granted, these are 16, 17, 18-year-old kids. They're not 41-year-old men that are running around doing this thing. So they could probably get away from it. I mean, depending on the sport they're getting back into. Though nonetheless, I think this goes back to the coaches having a pretty good understanding of who are the people that are on their team. And whether that's kind of a pre-season appraisal of, oh, okay, so I have a few of these athletes that were playing football before basketball, or were playing basketball before lacrosse. And so I just want to acknowledge, okay, well, I need to keep an eye out for these folks. Or maybe I need to talk to the sports trainer and say, hey, these are some individuals that we might want to keep an eye on, because I know that they just got done with a previous brutal season. So I might be more inclined to just check in. Hey, how are you feeling? Do you need a couple breaks, a few more water breaks or something like that, to make sure that they're getting the proper rest and conditioning and that we're aware of it?
And so I know we've talked a lot, we've leaned more on the boys' side of things with this, but from a girl's perspective, moving from basketball to softball or soccer to basketball. Do you think there's a difference just with the physicality and body makeup between boys and girls that plays into it, or do you really just think the rules follow the same for both?
I think the rules follow the same for both. I mean, it's important for us to be diligent about performance, and performance is not just getting out there and practicing and building strength and flexibility and speed. Performance is also recovery and rehabilitation. And so if we ignore that part, and we don't and we aren't mindful of the bandwidth of our student athletes and what they just got done doing and now what they're entering into, I think it's a big mistake. And it's something that coaches, they don't need to be medical professionals by any means, but I think it warrants a proper check-in on how are folks doing physically regardless of gender.
So really for the coaches, we're looking at three different things here. We're looking at the athletic director kind of setting the tone for the athletic department. We're also looking at the coaches working with the training staff to make sure that they have that information available to them. And then really it's then taking it down to the athletic standpoint where the coach or the athletic director is kind of, and the trainer putting it all together for the team.
Absolutely. And then you may also have unique circumstances for an individual athlete. You know, if an individual athlete gets invited to participate in some all-star game, you know, all right, well, they might choose to miss some regular season practices of this next sport to participate in this all-star game. We want to have all the athletes skip for the all-star game because they're not included. So like there's going to be those unique situations that even from coach to athlete, or coach athlete athletic director, or coach athlete trainer athletic director, could all be involved in that decision-making process. And also, I mean, with the caveat, it's also something that we don't necessarily need to overthink and be tremendously dramatic about. People have been participating in multiple sports since the dawn of time, probably. So I think we want to carry that reality. Most individuals are going to be fine. And I think it's probably good that we have some philosophy and culture behind how we want to manage these situations when they come up.
Yeah, so we've touched on a lot of different things. Is there anything else you want to talk about, kind of wrapping it up from the coach's perspective with two sport athletes before we kind of focus a little bit more on the athlete?
Yeah, I mean, I think one little final piece is going back to what is sport really doing? I mean, sport is about social, physical, mental, emotional growth and development. And so if you have a student athlete that's interested in participating in other sports, you know, I don't think that should be discouraged. I think we should really celebrate the opportunity that an individual is interested in trying to do other things and involve themselves in other activities. So coaches should just be mindful of, are they serving as a hindrance or an obstacle in some way for allowing athletes to do that, or are they understanding and serving as a bit of a platform for them to be able to do that? So coaches can just reflect. What is your, as a coach, you know, what is your philosophy about multi-sport athletes? And depending on that philosophy, how might that be impacting some of your interactions with these students?